Welcome back. Today we're diving into a topic that is often misunderstood, highly emotional, and surrounded by stereotypes. Why do some women seem to change dramatically after the age of 40? Is it simply hormones, or is something much deeper happening inside the brain and nervous system? In this video, we're going to separate myths from science. We'll explore what neuroscience, psychology, and human behavior actually tell us about midlife relationships, emotional regulation, and why some families experience major changes during this stage of life. My goal isn't to judge anyone, it's to understand the biology behind the behavior. So let's get started. Have you ever noticed how society is quick to label a woman over 40 as irrational, emotional, or even crazy the moment she starts changing? It's an easy explanation, but it's also one of the most misleading. If we want to understand what's actually happening, we have to step away from stereotypes and look at the biology of the brain, the nervous system, and the profound physiological changes that occur during midlife. One of the biggest misconceptions is that personality suddenly changes after 40. In reality, what often changes first is the brain's environment. The brain doesn't operate independently. Every thought, every emotional response, every decision you make is influenced by chemical signals circulating throughout the body. Hormones are among the most powerful of those signals, and during the years leading into menopause, known as perimenopause, those signals become far less predictable. For decades, the brain has adapted to relatively stable patterns of estrogen and progesterone. These hormones don't simply regulate reproduction, they influence sleep quality, attention, memory, motivation, stress resilience, emotional regulation, and even how the brain processes social interactions. When hormone levels begin fluctuating dramatically, the brain has to recalibrate. That recalibration doesn't happen overnight. It can take years. Think of the brain like an incredibly advanced operating system. When the software receives inconsistent signals, it doesn't immediately fail, but it starts working harder to maintain normal function. That extra effort can appear as increased emotional sensitivity, reduced patience, difficulty concentrating, or feeling overwhelmed by situations that previously seemed manageable. One of the first systems affected is sleep. Sleep isn't simply rest, it's the foundation upon which emotional stability is built. During deep sleep, the brain restores energy, strengthens memory, regulates immune function, and resets the circuits responsible for emotional control. When hormonal fluctuations disrupt sleep, the consequences extend into nearly every aspect of daily life. A person sleeping poorly for weeks or months becomes more reactive to stress. The emotional centers of the brain become more active, while the regions responsible for logical thinking and impulse control become less efficient. Small frustrations begin to feel much larger. Conversations that once ended calmly may now escalate more quickly, not because someone has become irrational, but because the brain is operating with fewer biological resources. Another important change involves the body's stress system. The nervous system is constantly balancing between states of calm and states of alertness. During midlife, this balance often becomes more fragile. Stress hormones may remain elevated longer after difficult situations. Recovery from emotional conflict may take more time. This means everyday responsibilities, work deadlines, family obligations, caregiving, financial pressure can create a much stronger physiological response than they did years earlier. This isn't weakness, it's biology. Now add another layer. Many women entering their 40s are simultaneously managing careers, raising teenagers, caring for aging parents, maintaining relationships, and handling countless invisible responsibilities that often go unnoticed. The brain isn't responding to one challenge. It's responding to multiple chronic stressors occurring simultaneously while its own internal chemistry is changing. Under these conditions, emotional reactions can become more intense, not because emotions are being created from nothing, but because the brain's filter becomes less efficient. Feelings that have existed quietly for years may suddenly become impossible to ignore. This is where people often misunderstand what's happening. They assume the hormonal changes create entirely new problems. More often, they amplify problems that already existed. Imagine carrying a heavy backpack every day for 20 years. At first, you barely notice the weight. Over time, your muscles compensate. Then suddenly your energy decreases while the backpack remains exactly the same. The weight hasn't changed, but your ability to carry it has. The same principle applies psychologically. Long-standing disappointments, unresolved conflicts, unmet emotional needs, chronic stress, or feelings of being unappreciated may have existed for years beneath the surface. As the brain works harder to adapt to changing biology, the capacity to suppress those feelings decreases. What looks like a sudden personality change is often the removal of years of emotional suppression. Another fascinating aspect involves brain networks responsible for self-reflection. Midlife is frequently associated with increased evaluation of personal meaning, purpose, and identity. People naturally begin asking questions they may have postponed for decades. Am I living the life I truly want? Have I ignored my own needs? What do I want the next 20 or 30 years to look like? These questions are not signs of instability. They're signs of cognitive maturation interacting with major life transitions. The important point is this: biology influences behavior, but it does not dictate character. Hormonal fluctuations can increase emotional intensity, reduce stress tolerance, and disrupt sleep, yet they do not remove a person's ability to think, reason, or make meaningful decisions. They simply make the brain work harder under conditions that are already demanding. Understanding this changes the conversation completely. Instead of asking, "Why is she acting differently?" a far better question becomes, what changes is her brain adapting to, and how can those around her respond with understanding instead of judgment? Because once you understand the nervous system, many behaviors that appear confusing begin to make perfect biological sense. And when biology is understood correctly, compassion often replaces criticism, creating healthier relationships and better outcomes for everyone involved. Have you ever wondered why some people appear to change dramatically in midlife, while others seem relatively stable? One of the biggest mistakes we make is assuming that these changes begin at the moment they become visible. In reality, what you're often seeing is not the beginning of the story. It's the point at which years of accumulated stress become impossible for the brain and body to ignore. The human nervous system is remarkably adaptive. It has an extraordinary ability to tolerate pressure for long periods of time. But adaptation is not the same as recovery. Just because someone continues functioning doesn't mean they are functioning without cost. Every day, the brain is tracking physical stress, emotional stress, sleep quality, social relationships, financial concerns, and countless other variables. Over months and years, these experiences leave measurable effects on the nervous system. For many women entering their 40s, life becomes uniquely demanding. They are often balancing multiple roles simultaneously. They may be advancing in their careers while also supporting children who are becoming teenagers or young adults. Many are caring for aging parents whose health is beginning to decline. Household responsibilities continue. Financial pressures often increase rather than decrease. On the surface, they may appear capable of handling everything, but internally, the nervous system is working continuously to keep all of these demands under control. One important concept in neuroscience is that the brain has limited resources for self-regulation. Attention, emotional control, patience, decision-making, and resilience all rely on biological energy. These resources are not infinite. Every unresolved conflict, every night of poor sleep, every stressful interaction draws from the same reserve. Now imagine this process continuing not for a week or a month, but for 20 years. Many people develop what psychologists sometimes describe as chronic emotional suppression. This doesn't necessarily mean hiding emotions intentionally. More often, it means repeatedly placing other people's needs ahead of your own. The brain learns to postpone frustration because there are children to raise, work responsibilities to meet, bills to pay, or relationships to preserve. Over time, postponing emotional needs becomes a habit. The remarkable thing is that the brain can maintain this pattern for years, but maintaining it requires energy. Eventually, the cost becomes significant. One of the first signs is emotional fatigue. Emotional fatigue is different from simply feeling tired. It reflects a nervous system that has spent years remaining vigilant, solving problems, anticipating other people's needs, and regulating emotions without adequate recovery. When this happens, the threshold for stress becomes lower. Situations that were once manageable now feel overwhelming, not because the individual has become weaker, but because their biological reserve has gradually been depleted. This is where many observers misunderstand what they're seeing. A woman who suddenly begins expressing dissatisfaction may be viewed as having changed overnight. In reality, the dissatisfaction may have existed for years. The difference is that her nervous system is no longer willing or able to continue suppressing it. Think about stress like filling a glass with water. One drop changes almost nothing. Hundreds of drops still leave room in the glass, but eventually one additional drop causes it to overflow. People often blame that final drop, even though the overflow was actually the result of everything that came before it. Human behavior works in much the same way. The visible reaction is rarely caused by one event alone. It reflects years of accumulated experiences reaching a threshold. Another important factor is cognitive load. Every decision the brain makes requires energy. Planning meals, remembering appointments, organizing family schedules, managing finances, anticipating children's needs, maintaining relationships, solving workplace problems. These tasks are mentally demanding even when they seem routine. Researchers often refer to this invisible burden as mental load. The challenge is that mental load doesn't disappear simply because someone appears calm. The brain continues processing these responsibilities even during periods of rest. Chronic cognitive demand keeps stress systems activated longer than they were designed to remain active. Over years, this can reduce emotional flexibility. Instead of responding thoughtfully to new problems, the brain begins reacting more quickly because it has fewer available resources for careful evaluation. This isn't evidence of poor character. It's evidence that chronic stress changes how efficiently the nervous system allocates attention and emotional regulation. There's also an important shift in priorities that often occurs during midlife. Earlier in adulthood, many individuals naturally focus on achievement, stability, raising children, and meeting external expectations. As people move through their 40s, however, the brain increasingly evaluates long-term meaning rather than simply short-term responsibility. Questions begin to emerge almost automatically. Am I living authentically? Have I spent decades meeting everyone else's expectations while neglecting my own? What kind of future do I actually want? These questions are not signs of instability. They reflect a healthy process of self-evaluation that often becomes stronger during midlife because people recognize that time is finite. The future no longer feels unlimited, and the brain begins assigning greater value to personal fulfillment, emotional health, and meaningful relationships. When chronic stress combines with this natural period of self-reflection, significant life decisions may follow. Some people establish healthier boundaries for the first time. Others decide they can no longer tolerate unhealthy patterns that have existed for years. To outside observers, these decisions can appear sudden or impulsive. But from the perspective of the nervous system, they are often the result of prolonged biological and psychological processing. Perhaps the most important lesson is that emotional exhaustion rarely announces itself early. It develops gradually, almost invisibly, while a person continues meeting responsibilities every day. By the time changes become obvious to family members or friends, the underlying process has usually been unfolding for years. Understanding this changes how we interpret behavior. Instead of assuming someone has suddenly become unreasonable, we begin recognizing the cumulative effects of chronic stress, mental overload, emotional suppression, and the brain's ongoing effort to adapt. That perspective doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does replace simplistic judgments with a far more accurate understanding of how the human brain responds to prolonged pressure over time. One of the most common misconceptions about relationships is the belief that families fall apart because of one dramatic event. People often point to a single argument, a single decision, or a single moment and conclude that this was the cause of everything. But when you examine human behavior through the lens of neuroscience and psychology, a very different picture emerges. Lasting relationships almost never collapse overnight. They usually weaken through a gradual process in which small, unresolved problems accumulate over months or even years until the emotional system can no longer compensate. The brain is constantly evaluating the quality of close relationships. Every interaction, whether positive or negative, becomes part of an ongoing prediction system. The nervous system asks a simple question over and over again. Am I emotionally safe here? This evaluation isn't something we consciously calculate. It happens automatically through networks involved in emotional regulation, memory, and social attachment. When interactions are consistently supportive, the brain begins associating the relationship with stability and safety. Stress hormones recover more quickly after conflict, emotional trust increases, and communication becomes easier. But when disappointment, criticism, neglect, or emotional distance become frequent, the brain begins updating its expectations. Instead of anticipating connection, it starts preparing for conflict or rejection. This process happens gradually. Most people don't notice it while it's occurring because the changes are small. One difficult conversation may seem insignificant. A missed opportunity to listen may appear harmless. A promise that isn't kept may feel minor. But the brain doesn't erase these experiences. It stores patterns, not isolated events. Imagine placing one small crack into a piece of glass every week. Each crack by itself appears manageable. The glass still functions, and from a distance it looks almost unchanged. But eventually the structure becomes so weakened that one final impact causes it to shatter. People blame the last impact because it is visible. In reality, the damage had been accumulating for a long time. Relationships often operate according to the same principle. One of the most important functions of healthy communication is emotional repair. Conflict itself is not dangerous. Every relationship experiences disagreements. What predicts long-term stability is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to repair emotional connection afterward. When misunderstandings are acknowledged, when both individuals feel heard, and when trust is rebuilt, the nervous system learns that temporary stress does not threaten the relationship. Problems begin when repair stops happening. If concerns are repeatedly dismissed, if emotions are minimized, or if difficult conversations are consistently avoided, the brain gradually concludes that expressing vulnerability is no longer useful. Instead of communicating openly, people begin protecting themselves emotionally. This protection often appears as withdrawal. At first, the withdrawal may be subtle. Someone shares less about their day. They stop discussing personal frustrations. They avoid conversations that once felt natural. They become quieter, not because they have nothing to say, but because previous attempts at communication produced little change. Over time, emotional distance grows. One fascinating characteristic of the brain is its tendency to adapt to repeated experiences. If emotional support becomes rare, the nervous system eventually stops expecting it. Expectations shape perception. Once trust begins declining, even neutral interactions may be interpreted more negatively because the brain is constantly predicting future outcomes based on past experience. This creates a feedback loop. Reduced communication leads to reduced understanding. Reduced understanding increases misunderstandings. More misunderstandings increase emotional distance. Greater emotional distance makes meaningful communication even less likely. Without intervention, this cycle strengthens itself. Another important factor is chronic stress. When individuals experience ongoing stress from work, finances, parenting, health concerns, or caregiving responsibilities, the brain prioritizes immediate survival over emotional connection. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for thoughtful decision-making and empathy, becomes less efficient under prolonged stress, while the brain's threat detection systems become more active. As a result, conversations become less curious and more defensive. People interrupt more quickly. They assume negative intentions more often. They become less patient with one another. Again, this is not necessarily because love has disappeared. It is because chronic stress changes how the nervous system processes social information. Something else happens that many people overlook. Emotional needs rarely disappear simply because they are ignored. Instead, they become quieter until a certain threshold is reached. A person may spend years convincing themselves that things will eventually improve, that circumstances will change, or that sacrificing their own needs is necessary for the family. But the brain continues recording emotional imbalance. Eventually, there comes a point where maintaining the relationship requires more psychological energy than changing it. This is often the moment that surprises everyone else. Friends and relatives may say, everything seemed fine, but fine often means that conflict remained invisible, not that it was absent. Many people become extremely skilled at maintaining external stability while experiencing significant internal dissatisfaction. They continue fulfilling responsibilities, attending family events, supporting children, and maintaining routines. From the outside, the family appears healthy. Internally, however, emotional connection may have been steadily weakening for years. This explains why major relationship decisions frequently appear sudden to observers, but not to the individuals making them. The decision itself may occur in one moment, but the neurological and emotional process leading to that decision has often been developing over thousands of daily interactions. The important lesson is that healthy relationships are built less by grand gestures and more by consistent patterns. Small moments of listening, appreciation, empathy, honesty, and emotional repair strengthen the nervous system's sense of safety over time. Likewise, repeated neglect, unresolved conflict, and emotional disconnection gradually erode that same sense of security. Understanding this shifts the conversation away from blame and toward awareness. Families rarely break because of one isolated event. More often, they reflect the cumulative effects of countless small interactions that either strengthen trust or slowly weakened it. Recognizing those patterns early gives people the opportunity to rebuild connection before emotional distance becomes so great that repair feels impossible. If there is one principle that consistently emerges from neuroscience, psychology, and decades of behavioral research, it is this: the brain responds far more effectively to understanding than to judgment. When people are faced with behaviors they don't understand, the natural tendency is to assign labels. We call someone difficult, irrational, selfish, or impossible to communicate with. But labels rarely explain behavior. They simply stop curiosity. And the moment curiosity disappears, the opportunity for understanding begins to disappear as well. The human brain is designed to search for patterns. It constantly tries to predict why people behave the way they do. When information is missing, the brain fills the gaps with assumptions. Unfortunately, those assumptions are often inaccurate because they are based on our own experiences rather than the experiences of the other person. This becomes especially important during major life transitions. Midlife is not simply a change in age. It is a period during which multiple biological, psychological, and social systems are changing simultaneously. Hormonal shifts can influence sleep quality, energy levels, emotional regulation, and stress recovery. Responsibilities often increase rather than decrease. Parents may require care at the same time children still depend on support. Careers become more demanding, financial decisions become more significant, and questions about personal purpose become increasingly difficult to ignore. When all of these factors occur together, The nervous system is processing far more information than most people realize. Now consider what happens if the people closest to that individual interpret every visible change as a personal attack. A request for more support is viewed as criticism. Emotional exhaustion is mistaken for hostility. A desire for personal space is interpreted as rejection. Frustration becomes labeled as instability. The relationship immediately shifts from cooperation to defense. Once the brain perceives that it is not being understood, another predictable response begins to emerge. Instead of becoming more open, people generally become more protective. This is one of the nervous system's most fundamental survival mechanisms. Emotional safety determines how willing someone is to communicate honestly. If a person expects judgment, they naturally reveal less. If they expect empathy, they reveal more. That difference changes everything. One of the remarkable characteristics of the human brain is its capacity for neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself in response to repeated experiences. Every conversation, every interaction, every emotional exchange strengthens certain neural pathways while weakening others. If two people repeatedly communicate with criticism, interruption, and defensiveness, the brain gradually learns to anticipate conflict. Even neutral conversations begin with elevated physiological tension because previous experiences have conditioned the nervous system to expect disagreement. The opposite is also true. Repeated experiences of respectful listening, calm discussion, and emotional validation gradually retrain the brain to associate the relationship with psychological safety. This process does not require perfection. It requires consistency. One calm conversation will not completely transform years of emotional distance, but hundreds of calm conversations absolutely can. The brain changes through repetition. Another important concept involves emotional regulation. Many people believe emotional regulation means suppressing feelings or pretending not to experience them. In reality, emotional regulation is the ability to experience emotions without allowing them to control behavior. That ability depends heavily on the condition of the nervous system. Adequate sleep improves emotional regulation. Regular physical activity improves stress resilience. Healthy social connection reduces physiological stress responses. Predictable daily routines support stable brain function. These factors may appear simple, but together they influence the biological foundation upon which communication is built. When individuals neglect these foundations, even small interpersonal challenges become much more difficult to navigate. This is why understanding biology is so valuable. It reminds us that behavior does not emerge in isolation. Every response is influenced by the interaction between the brain, the body, previous experiences, current stress levels, sleep quality, and environmental demands. Recognizing this complexity does not remove personal responsibility. People remain responsible for how they treat others. However, understanding the biological influences behind behavior allows us to respond more intelligently instead of reacting impulsively. One of the greatest strengths within healthy families is the willingness to replace assumptions with questions. Instead of saying, "You've changed," someone asks, "What have you been carrying that I haven't noticed?" Instead of saying, "You're overreacting," they ask, "What is making this situation feel so overwhelming?" Instead of immediately defending themselves, they become genuinely curious. Curiosity has a remarkable effect on the nervous system. Feeling understood reduces physiological stress. Feeling heard lowers emotional defensiveness. Feeling respected increases openness. These are measurable changes occurring within the brain and body, not merely abstract psychological concepts. Over time, this creates an environment where difficult conversations become less threatening. People stop focusing exclusively on winning arguments and begin focusing on solving problems together. Trust gradually rebuilds because emotional safety has been restored. Perhaps the most powerful realization is that understanding someone does not require agreeing with every decision they make. Empathy is not the same as approval. It simply means recognizing that every behavior has causes, even when those causes are not immediately visible. When families begin approaching conflict with that mindset, communication changes dramatically. Conversations become slower. People interrupt less. They listen more carefully. They ask better questions. They become less interested in assigning blame and more interested in identifying solutions. This is where lasting relationships become stronger, not because conflict disappears, but because both individuals develop a deeper understanding of how the human brain responds to stress, change, uncertainty, and emotional challenge. Ultimately, the strongest relationships are rarely built on perfect compatibility. They are built on repeated moments of patience, curiosity, respect, and understanding. When people learn to see behavior through the lens of biology and human experience rather than quick judgment, they create conditions where trust can grow, emotional resilience can recover, and families have a far greater chance of navigating even the most difficult stages of life together. The more we understand how the brain responds to stress, hormones, sleep, and years of accumulated emotional experiences, the less likely we are to rely on stereotypes and quick judgments. Real understanding leads to better communication, stronger relationships, and healthier decisions. If you found this video valuable, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who could benefit from this perspective. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.